Well, good morning, and thanks for coming out. It's wonderful to see so many of you, despite these inhospitable conditions. Your presence today is evidence, yet again, of the deep commitment this community has for the mission and purpose of Brookfield Academy. So again, thank you for being here. The Center for Mission and Academics, in presenting the Classical Heritage Series, seeks to ask worthwhile questions and allow thoughtful reconsiderations of how certain topics align with our identity as an institution. As part of an ongoing examination of how curriculum aligns with mission, Mrs. Pryor asked some of us to explore how and why we teach history the way we do at BA. To consider, especially in light of so much of the controversy surrounding education recently, what it is that we value in the teaching of history and how it serves our ultimate goal of educating the whole person in the skills, values, and heritage of constructive, responsible, free people. And whether we like it or not, schools and teachers don't get to choose whether we teach values. Schools and teachers are always affecting values by what we decide to praise and punish, how we balance students' differing needs, how we articulate students' obligations to each other, how we teach the lessons of our past. The question isn't whether schools teach values, it's whether we choose to be deliberate about it. Exercises like this encourage us to be a bit more deliberate. So again, what is being deliberated is the what, how, and why of instruction in history. In this regard, the overarching question that confronts us is why study history? Perhaps another way of asking the question, why study history, is what story should we tell about the past? As Mrs. Pryor told you, I'm David Wacholz, an upper school English teacher and sometimes history teacher, and I'm here today to discuss three related ideas. First, history is narrative. It's story, and it matters a great deal what story we tell and how we tell it. Second, the principal narrative of the Western world is how the relentless striving for freedom has shaped our civilization. And third, that the careful study of history is not about learning what to avoid, nor is it a means of rewarding ourselves on our advanced sensibilities. We study history for humble reminders of what man is capable, good and bad. Reading the narrative arcs of epochs and individuals ought to be undertaken with humility and wonder, and should remind us to resist the twin seductions of sentimentality and certitude. As a humanities teacher, I'm sensitive to the fundamental way that narrative works in our lives, both in and out of the classroom. Since narrative is intrinsic to humans, it's the most natural and potentially rewarding of studies. Reading narratives, both fictional and non-fictional, gives us intimate contact with the best and the worst in human nature, the honorable and dishonorable, and provides both mirror and lamp, a mirror for self-examination and a lamp for illumination. But what are we hoping to illuminate? What do we want to bring to light? History is not, nor ought it ever be, a mere sequential list of victories and conquests, dynasties and uprisings, indictments and accusations, what George Santayana calls one damn thing after another. Rather, it's a rich story or series of stories that cohere around an identifiable plot about the human condition, a plot that concerns human will. For this reader, the basic truth at the bottom of this conversation is that history begins with a sense of wonder. Why and how did that happen? What's next? Clearly, there is a positive relationship between curiosity and knowledge, and it is cause and effect that powers curiosity. So how do we activate and engage curiosity? It's no small task, but these few ideas maybe can help shape the conversation about how and why we teach history. So firstly, history is narrative. The construction of explanatory stories is intimately related to both the intellectual and existential impulse we have to organize experience. We want things to be coherent, so we construct order. We hate vacuums. We crave order, and out of that need for order emerges the story of identity, of individuals, of community, of nations, and of history. As meaning-making agents, What we do with the odds and ends of experience closely correspond to what we do with our collective past. We consider and absorb tensions, conflicts, and resolutions that lead to new tensions, conflicts, and resolutions. We ask questions about cause and effect and remind ourselves that at the center of it all is human agency, a usually flawed hero who, like ourselves, must reconcile a host of competing expectations and demands. One more important thing that a narrative sensitivity grants us when studying history is an appreciation for the complexity of human individuals and an awareness of the human scale of humans doing the work of humans. This sensitivity moves us away from the foolishness of no-fault history, as well as the fatalism of assuming that men are mere puppets of the gods or of nature or other isms. When we humanize both heroes and villains, we remind ourselves of that ageless adage, nothing human is alien to me. Secondly, of all the stories we might tell about how we have become what we are, for good and bad, what story is the most compelling and complete? I would contend that it is the relentless push for freedom. It's about going back to the beginnings of an unbroken chain of events that began in the Eastern Mediterranean. Authority and liberation, convention and revolt, tyranny and personal sovereignty. These are the creative rhythms of civilization. They are as vivid in the history of politics as in the history of art, poetry, science, technology, education, and religion. Although there are many worthwhile competing narratives about the West, we may be wise to remind ourselves that we get one chance to lay the right track for students. Most people will not casually, let alone seriously, contemplate history. Welcome to the human race. How many people are going to sit down and read a 1,000-page biography of Ulysses Grant? So you get a chance to lay track. What they might remember is the narrative arc laid for them in the classroom. Will that narrative be one that is steeped in indictment and recrimination? Or will it be one that allows a careful deliberation of man's complexity, even as it encourages a modest celebration of his accomplishments? When Martin Luther King declared that the arc of history is long and that it bends toward justice, he was working from a narrative assumption, an assumption millennia in the making. In this conversation, justice is closely allied to the freedom of the individual. Historian Russell Kirk provides a splendid historical narrative of the march of justice and freedom in his book, The Roots of American Order, which challenges its readers to understand that there's no understanding what happened in Philadelphia, July 4th, 1776, without first understanding the legacy of the four fundamental cultures of Israel, Athens, Rome, and London. That the long, slow transmission of the drive for purposeful self-mastery begins with Mosaic law, passes through the democracies of Greece and Rome, is fine-tuned in the traditions of English common law, and has been incubating for nearly 3,000 years by the time it finds its expression in the American experiment. Here, too, Lord Acton's famous History of Freedom in Antiquity and Christianity is an invaluable resource to better understand the march of freedom and the ascendancy of the human individual. Both Kirk and Acton assert that the ideals of ordered liberty, of purposeful self-assertiveness, dictate the trajectory of the rise of the West. Lest we neglect the basic difference between liberty and license, we may want to consider there are two contesting ideas of freedom in the Western world today. The one with which we're most familiar, because it dominates our culture through the language of choice, is a notion that freedom is simply a matter of personal willfulness. Freedom is what I want to do. And that's okay as long as what I want to do doesn't hurt anybody else. But the idea that freedom has something to do with choosing what is right, choosing what is good, choosing what we know will lead to human flourishing, this idea is the older and more durable idea of the West. In some sense, it goes all the way back to the Athenians of the 7th century BC. It's the idea that freedom has to do, at some base level, with virtue. Even the very notion of virtue, the word virtue at its Latin root, vir, means man. In other words, as if to suggest virtue is that which a man ought to be. That freedom has to do with goodness, that freedom is having the right, as Lord Acton put it, to do what we ought. Or to put it another way, to be truly free, is to be able to freely choose that which is objectively good, that which really makes for genuine human flourishing. So we've got this contentless idea of freedom. Freedom is choice, emphasis on me, myself, and I, and my needs. And you've got a richer, thicker notion of, say, good and evil, nobility and ignobility, competing for our attention when we think about what freedom is. Both of them are on full display in the study of history. Undoubtedly, human beings will fall short of these ideals of what we say freedom, justice, these things ought to be. However, that does not invalidate them. In fact, it arms us with a powerful tool, the accusation of hypocrisy. The emerging Western idea that every man, king, saint, robber, knight, unwashed serf, that every one had an inviolable, immortal soul and its capacity for progress toward justice and freedom, that's foundational. Therefore, any violation of the individual, of which there are many, no doubt, could be met with the outcry of hypocrite. The sanctity of the human individual is fundamentally built into our civilization's code and has proved an invaluable tool for our progress towards justice. One last remark about story, or stories we ought to tell. Without a foundation of first principles, some governing force that helps us to make sense of disparate facts and experiences, the study of history becomes either a meaningless accumulation of unrelated facts or the means of indicting those who had the misfortune of not being as enlightened as ourselves. We owe it to ourselves and our students to tell them a worthwhile and affirming story that begins before us and goes on after us, but whose outcome we may influence. The story further reminds us that the important thing is to play our part well, which brings us to what we hope our students take from the study of history. The study of history should teach humility, patience, and prudence. One acquires prudence by patient observation and cautious investigation. And it becomes the director, the regulator, the standard of all judgments. The study of history reminds us that the march of the human mind and human institutions is slow. It reminds us, in the words of Edmund Burke, that the individual is often foolish. The multitude is foolish when they act without deliberation, but the species is wise. And when time is given to it, as a species, it typically acts right. The study of history ought to caution us against both nostalgia and progressive zealotry. The study of history reveals to us that men cannot improve society by setting fire to it. In this vein, the study of history reminds us that the ideologue is really the real threat to freedom, and that slogans usually lead to bullets, that there really are few alternatives to moderation, and they usually include fierce factionalism, dictatorship, or anarchy. Moderation is a key lesson that we ought to get in the study of history. The study of history reminds us that civilized man needs useful, reasonable, and accurate generalizations about the world and his place in it. The study of history also reminds us that the pursuit of freedom, the triumph over tyranny and arbitrary rule, is really the bedrock of the Western world. In fact, when we think about freedom today, we can't help but notice that it's so important to the human condition that where it's withheld, it's regarded as essential as food and shelter. The study of history cautions us to avoid the arrogance of indictment, as well as the blindness of false reverence. Both hero worship and sentimentalism about the nature of human beings too often lead to a sort of fanaticism and hubris. In short, the proper study of history ought to make us wise and humble, and therefore can serve as an antidote to superficiality and arrogance.